Hi, thank you for coming. I look forward to talking to you. Thank for Tech Plus for inviting me here today. My name is Jay Elliott. I wrote a book. The book is called The Steve Jobs Way. And basically, one of the questions I always get is, why did I write the book? And basically, the reason I wrote the book was I wanted to tell the world that there's a new paradigm of leadership that's occurring. And we need to make sure that we sort of catch the wave. I've been very lucky in my life. I have worked for companies like IBM. I worked for companies like Intel. Then I worked for a company called Apple. And while at IBM, I was fortunate enough to work with a fellow called Tom Watson Jr., who was the CEO and chairman of IBM. It was one of the formations of the computer industry. When I worked at IBM, IBM had over 400,000 employees. It was number 2 in the world and dominated. It was 80% of the computer market. But Tom Watson Jr. was an amazing visionary. He was a great leader. I liked IBM. I had a great opportunity. But IBM really wasn't who I was. And I had to really figure out later where to go and where to make that happen. So I left IBM, went to work for a smaller company, which I thought was smaller at the time, called Intel. I worked for a guy named Andy Grove, worked for a guy named Gordon Moore, and a guy named Bob Noyce. Gordon Moore was the person who had Moore's Law, so a very intellectual guy. Bob Noyce was the co-founder of the semiconductor. So Bob Noyce was the guy with Dr. Shockley of Stanford that really created Silicon Valley. So I learned a lot working there. I was really very fortunate to understand how they operated the company and their leadership's ability to make things happen. But it really wasn't what I wanted to do. So I really started thinking about, again, of who I was and what I wanted to do in the future. Every now and then in your life, something happens. And the thing about when it happens, you have to be open to that. I was sitting in a restaurant. I was sitting on a bench. I was waiting for my wife to have dinner. And I was a little bit depressed because I didn't like Intel and I was looking for the next adventure in my life. And sitting next to me all of a sudden was a young guy who was about 25 years old. And I was reading a newspaper. And in the paper I was looking at an article about IBM, about the computer industry, and this guy said, "Do you know anything about computers?" And I said, "Yeah, I do. I've been in the computer industry. I'm a software engineer by trade, and so I understand computers very well." He said, "Well, my name is Steve Jobs." And he said, "I have a company called Apple Computer." And I'd never heard of either one of them. So I said, "Well, that's nice, but here's this kid, 25 years old, scruffy looking, in Levi's, in a white t-shirt," and I said, "I really don't know who you are, but I'll listen to you." So then we started engaging in a conversation about sort of the world, where everything was going to go. We talked about sort of this ability to move information down to the individual at a desktop. And then he talked about his Apple company was building computers to be able to do that. So we ended up in this conversation, and he said, "You know, I really would like you to come work for me." And I said, "But I don't know you." And he said, "Well, I think that I really like you." And I was really enthralled by his enthusiasm and the way he presented everything. It was sort of the beginning of an adventure. But the more interesting thing about that meeting was the way we looked. What we really connected on is I was as hippie looking as he was. And at that time, I was an executive from IBM. I was an executive from Intel, and you can tell that, however, I didn't look like the normal executive in Silicon Valley. I was really more thought about where I wanted to go, and I didn't believe that appearance had any importance to me. Now, the other interesting thing about Steve Jobs in those days, he always wore white shirts. He wore Levi's and white shirts and Birkenstock, and ultimately in his life, later on, he changed who he looked like. So that was the beginning. And I think what's important about this beginning is being open. And my advice to all of you, and this is what Steve was about, is you always look for that next opportunity. You always look for that next person. You always look for the next thing that can happen to you, and it's really important, and that's how my adventure started at Apple. The next part of my adventure was, at that time, Apple produced a product called the Apple II. The Apple II was the first personal computer. It was sort of clunky looking. It had floppy disk drives, it had a monitor, had a keyboard. But what's really important about the Apple II, this is 1978 technology, was that it really introduced the world to how to use something on their desk to do computing. But the other interesting point about this computer was underneath the hood, underneath the how it operated, was something that was very important to look at. Number one, the Apple II had great sales because of an app called VisiCalc. VisiCalc was a small app that was the first financial app to be introduced in the computer industry, and that drove sales of the Apple II. So number one, an app. Number two, there was a very strong group of users, and those users were called school teachers. School teachers loved the Apple II because it was the first product they could use. They could program themselves, they could look at it, they could use it in the classroom, and it became really a great tool for education. And so that really sort of became the other part of it. And the third part of it was games. It was the first computer you could play games on. So if you looked at the beginning of a major industry of where we are today, the Apple II was the first product. But the important thing about it is part of the understanding of product and understanding why Steve Jobs was so successful, that he was product driven. He understood the product, he understood what it did, but he understood what came out of it and where it could go. And that was an interesting part of this product, that it really set a direction for the rest of where the world can go. When I met Steve in 1980, I went to work for him. He called me after I accepted a job. And again, I had to think about it because I was 12 years older than Steve. So I was going to work for a kid who was 26 years old, and I'm 38. And I had to really think about, could I really do that? But I was so enthralled about his enthusiasm, about his spirit, about his vision, that I decided I would do it. So on a Saturday, he called me and said, Jay, I want to take you for a ride and show you something. So we went up to a place called Palo Alto Park. Palo Alto Park was the Xerox development center for Xerox. And while we were there, one of the things that we recognized in the early days of computers was they weren't that easy to use. There was a lot of fear by the users. You know, how can we really have to look at how do we use this product, and it really wasn't that easy to use. And so we were concerned about how do we stop this fear factor? How do we make it easier? How do we make it easier for the individual? How do we make it easier for anybody who wants to use it? And this really was the thing we were looking for. So while at Xerox Park, they were showing us this new computer system they were developing called the STAR system. And the STAR system was Xerox's first involvement in looking at computer systems. Now, what people don't realize is at that moment in time, Xerox owned 20% of Apple. So Xerox had invested $1 million in Apple, and they owned 20% of them. So they invited us up there as an investor in our company to take a look at their technology. We ran into, on that visit, something very unique. And the uniqueness thing was called a mouse. And if you think about this is 1980. How many years ago is that? And we're still using the same technology called the mouse. And what Steve saw into the mouse was the beginning of a better technology, a better user interface, and a way to cut down the fear of how to use this product. And that particular technology really set the stage for where we are today. But it also set the stage of a product that could be used by a 3-year-old to a 90-year-old. If you think about it, very few products in the world can span that age group from one to the other. So it really started a revolution of where this product could be used. So the mouse was it. The amazing thing about the mouse is that this is 1980. Xerox had built it, it already worked, they had it, and never put it to the marketplace. The mouse was never put by Xerox into a product. It took 4 years for us to develop the Macintosh with the mouse and the software, and nobody did anything. Nobody, like, at that time, as I told you earlier, IBM was 80% of the computer market. They were the second largest corporation in the world. Xerox was about number 8. None of them saw what Steve Jobs saw in this user interface. And that's really important to think about, because what we're talking about here is this absolute involvement in the product. Products are really what it's about, and products are really what you make happen. Now, in 1980, we started the Macintosh group in Apple. It was sort of like a startup inside a corporation. It started with 7 of us. We built the first design of the Mac. I'm in this picture up in the right-hand corner. I was that young guy with a beard. And this table is some very young people. And Steve Jobs used to have a saying, never trust anybody over 30 years old except for Jay. And the reason he would say that is sometimes people get older, they get closed-minded. And it wasn't about your age, it was about keeping your mind open to what the possibilities are. We at that moment in 1980 and 1980, from 80 to 84, never really truly appreciated what we were designing, what we were starting as a revolution. But today you look at the computer market, you look at the handheld market, you look at what we do today, it's all revolved around user interface. Steve was always fascinated with his hand. He would sit in meetings and hours, just sitting there talking, but he always was looking at his hand, because his hand was like, he felt was really this incredible robotic feature of the human body, but also as an incredible way to communicate. I can point to you, I can say things to you, I can react to you, so it was a communication. And the mouse to him was a reflection of the hand. And that's why this technology became so important, because Steve really saw that the future is going to be and how the hand is going to relate to future technology. He also had this, what I call product passion, that if you're going to build a company and you're going to have a product, you better love the product yourself. And the Steve Jobs system was, it's my product, I love it, I'm building it for myself first, and if you like it, great. If you want to buy it, great. If you don't buy it. But I'm building it for me first, I love it, and when I'm finished with building it, I'm going to show it to you. And that's really an important feature of principle of iLeadership, is that you, whoever you are in a company, whoever you are in the corporate world, wherever you are in the world, you better build products that you love. Now, the Macintosh was introduced in 1984, and think about it, 4 years later after we saw it, and nobody did anything about it. And it also was an interesting product because it was self-contained. At that time, the computer industry had modular computers. You bought different keyboards, you bought different screens, you bought different disk drives. It was a modular, basically, computer industry, but this product was self-contained. It also was that you learned how to, very easy to use. It took a while to learn in the early days of the mouse, but it was easy. Now, the Macintosh also introduced itself. So at a stage like this, the curtain opened up, the Mac was sitting on a stool, and it basically said, hello, I'm Macintosh. Now, what people don't realize at that moment in time, it was the first computer with a speaker in it. So even that little touch doesn't mean a lot, but think about where we are today. It was the first thing that was able to communicate with a human through a speaker. Now, up until 10 minutes before it did that, it didn't work. So I'm not sure that as it did it, that there wasn't somebody with a microphone behind doing it, but that's a different story. But anyway, but it was a first story. Now, it also was the first time that Steve Jobs stood on a stage and introduced a product, which became later in life, came his hallmark way that the products were about. But that was the first product he ever introduced. Now, the problem with that introduction of that product, there's a company called Apple. Apple had an Apple II division. The Apple II part of Apple was 3,000 people. The Macintosh part of Apple was 100 people. So now you have a new product, a new vision, a new direction for the company, but you have an old product and an old direction that makes money. And unfortunately, Steve hired a guy named John Sculley to come in and become the CEO of the company, run the company. And unfortunately, as Mac got introduced, the original Mac, by the way, for its great technology and its great features, was a failure. It did not sell well. It didn't have a hard drive. It didn't have a color screen. And unfortunately, it was headed for corporate America. So they chose to make sure that that product was competing with IBM. And IBM dominated the marketplace. But in the core of it, it was not a corporate product. It was a consumer product. But unfortunately, it got directed to the wrong place. So it actually failed. And the failure of that product caused a major stir at Apple. It caused ultimately John Sculley and the board of directors to throw Steve out. I personally went to the board of directors and saying, you're making a huge mistake. He's a visionary. He's the founder of the company. He's where we're going to go. He's not the past. He's the future. And Apple has to look at the future. The Macintosh the future. Unfortunately, I lost the argument, and eventually I got fired myself. But it really showed that sometimes corporations get caught up in the wrong things. After Apple, Steve went to a company called Next. And Next was a company where Steve built a whole new computing system that was about $10,000, and it was way too expensive. It was a great system and had great software, but it too was a failure. So basically, Steve Jobs had done 2 failures in a row. And that's really important for him because he totally failed at Apple, and then he goes to Next and totally fails at Next. But what's important about this experience is self-introspection, self-looking at yourself. What did I do wrong? And what Steve did is he kept his head up and he kept moving ahead, and he figured out what he did wrong. What he did wrong was that inside of Steve was a consumer guy. Inside of Steve, what the whole magic of his ability to make products was that he was a consumer. He was the #1 user of his own products. He was the #1 user of products in the world. And that's very important to understand. So what he finally figured out was, I met a guy named George Lucas once, to a friend of mine, and he was looking to sell a company called Pixar. And actually I said, I have a guy named Steve Jobs that might be interested in buying the company from you. So George Lucas and Steve Jobs met, and Steve bought a company called Pixar. He paid $20 million for it and sold it to Disney 8 years later for $5.5 billion. But Pixar had the perfect ingredients to be the way that a company should be. It had great talent, it had good leadership, it had a very direction of where they wanted to go, but it was missing one thing. It was missing a product. Pixar, up until Steve Jobs took it over, never produced a film over 2 minutes in length. And so what Steve brought to that company was a product. And this is a very important lesson. You got to have a product. You got to be committed to the product. So the product they had was called Toy Story. So Toy Story turned out to be not only a record movie but it changed the industry. And I think this is a very important factor of, again, back to the legacy of Steve Jobs and the legacy of what I call leadership. You do things that leap forward in the market, not just take a small step. And that's really what Steve Jobs and everything he's did took a leap. This product changed the whole direction of animated films. And after that, there was 5 or 6 films, but changed exactly where animated films were, which is really important. Now, in 2001, I attended a conference in San Francisco, and Steve Jobs outlaid the future. And he said the future is called a digital hub. Basically, what's going to happen is all information is going to come into a hub, and then we're going to move it out to a user, and that user is going to have multiple devices. They're going to have something that does with music, something that does with pictures, something that does with media, something that does with computers, something that does with cameras. And so his idea was what I'll call a digital hub. When I sat there in 2001 and I saw this vision, I said, Steve has nailed it again, because that is the future. He knows where this is going to go, and he's going to build Apple along that line of what that hub is going to look like. And basically, at the time he came back to Apple, some of the pundits and some of the critics of Apple were concerned when he canceled the Newton. The Newton was a product that Apple had, and the Newton was a product that was starting to sell well, but Steve felt that the quality of it wasn't that good, but it had nothing to do with Apple. It had nothing in the software to do with Apple, and it didn't fit into the Apple family. And that's really important about this concept of a digital hub, is that all the products work together. All the products come off the same kind of synchronization software. They all work together, and they all work on the same vein. And that was really what the whole concept of the digital hub was about. Now, one of the things that's important in all the things we do, and particularly with what Steve Jobs did, Steve took incredible attention and incredible involvement in details of the product. Sometimes I hear criticism of that. Well, how could Steve be involved in everything? It was because he was conceptually concerned that the details of every product was going to be absolutely effective and efficient. Secondly, part of that was then you don't have 100 products. You only have 6. You only have 5. But you make sure that those products are going to be the best in the world. This is a product called the Model A Ford, done by Henry Ford. The other part of the story also is that you got to have heroes. Steve Jobs had a hero. Henry Ford was one of his heroes. Henry Ford changed the automotive industry. What he did was he created a car, mass-produced it, and basically when everything came into his manufacturing plant, it went out the back door in the car. Even the crates that the car were in were put in the car. So the bottom boards of the car were the part of the crates that the parts were shipped in. So everything came in. Secondly, when you think about it, in 1928, when the car was introduced to the public, there was no way to fix it. There was no service stations. So they even asked Henry Ford, well, how did you know people wanted it? He said, well, did you go out and ask them? He said, no. And this is the other part of the Steve Jobs legacy. I didn't go out and ask the consumers. I just went to them and said, what do you want? They would say a faster horse, because that was the dominant transportation. So what he did was, he would pay attention to the details of the car. And the important part of this is that you got to have heroes. Heroes are people you look to and said, what have they done? Henry Ford was one of Steve's heroes. Arthur Land was one of his heroes. So people that had done things in the marketplace. Gutenberg was one of Steve's heroes, even though he invented the printing press many, many years before, but he changed an industry. These are industry changers, and those are the people that Steve really related to. The next part of the story is that, by the way, in that car I showed you, when I was 15 years old, I lived on a 1,000-acre ranch in California. My father gave me that car because I farmed the ranch that year. He said to me, it's your turn, you're 15 years old now, you need to farm the ranch yourself. So I took over the ranch. We had 100 cows, we had crops, we had a crew. I took over and I did the ranch myself. And that really was sort of, to me, the beginning of my own internal entrepreneurship. But what Steve had learned coming back to Apple, that he was a consumer guy. And the first thing he did was, secondly, he was a user of consumer information. In this case, he was a user of music. He loved music. He loved media. He loved the music so well that he wanted to be able to move it with him. Steve and I spent a lot of time in Japan. We spent a lot of time with Mr. Morito at Sony, understanding what Sony was doing. Because Sony in those days, back in the 80s, was really a dominant company. And Mr. Morito had built the Sony Walkman because he wanted to listen to music on a flight to Paris. And so he had the Walkman built. But if you look at the Sony Walkman, it wasn't digital. It was now we were moving into a digital age. It was very clunky looking. Steve said, I want to build a digital MP3 player, basically, that has only one button. It doesn't have multi-buttons on it. I want it to be small, and I want it to be very efficient to use. The second thing he did was, which is very important. Now, an interesting story, we're at a meeting, and the developers come in with a prototype of the product, and it looked too big. And they said, this is as small as we can make it. And Steve said, hand it to me. Hand it to him. He went and dropped it in a fish tank, and bubbles came out. And he said, if there's bubbles, there's space. Go back, make it smaller. And this is, again, sort of this attention to details that eventually made the MP3 player or the iPod work. But the most important part of it was a thing called iTunes. Now, going back to the origination of Apple, when Apple got its logo, Apple name, and Apple logo, it came from a group called the Beatles. The Beatles had a company called Apple Records. And if you look at the old albums of Apple Records, they had a bite taken out of the apple. So that's where Steve loved the Beatles. And so obviously the logo for Apple came from the Beatles. So in signing a contract to get the logo and get the name Apple for Apple Computer, part of the contract said that Apple will never go in the music industry. Now Steve also had a way of saying, and it's sort of a legacy that goes on, oh, don't worry about it. Well, that part of the contract called Apple about $300 million about 2 years ago. So the Beatles said, we want our money, so he paid him for it. But under the current of that product, the glue to Apple was iTunes. And it's one of the more brilliant things about it, that it was a river that flows through the system, everything connects to it, and it was really, again, that's the difference between Apple and other companies, is that the glue to their products was another under river called iTunes. So now everything goes to iTunes. I want to buy music. But the other part of it was that the music industry was in trouble at that time. And the music industry is being ripped off by Napster. They were having trouble with controlling security of the music industry. And Steve single-handedly went to the music industry and said, I can help you. I can make a system that you download the song for 99 cents. I will make it secure. It'll be encrypted. You don't have to worry about security. So that was a very critical point of it. The other part of Apple is, when you buy an Apple computer, it comes in a great box. And now today, one of the targets we had in the early days was, we didn't want an owner's manual. We didn't want you to have to learn anything. You just open the box, pull the product out, and it's so intuitive that it works. In the early days of Mac, we couldn't make that happen. We had to build an owner's manual. We're sitting in a meeting, again, the way Steve operated, and they come in and say, okay, we need an owner's manual, but it has to be written at a 9th grade level, which is a senior in high school in the United States. not a senior in high school, but his freshman in high school, 12th grade level, I'm sorry. And so we went to a local high school, got a bunch of 12th graders together and said, we're going to contest. So the original manual for Mac was written by a 12th grader. And that again is Steve's attitude about let's do it right. The original graphics for the Mac came from a restaurant in San Francisco. Steve was having dinner, looked at the restaurant, looked at the menu for the restaurant, loved the graphics, said, who did this? They said, an artist. Said, go hire that person to be the graphics person for Macintosh. It was looking at life in a different way. And I think that now if you look at the iPhone, look at the iPad, the digital hub has been completed. And I think one of the things that Steve wanted before his death was to make sure that he had completed the digital hub. And the undercurrent of this hub now is the same operating system. So when I have my iPhone, I have my iPad, I have my iPod, I have my Mac computer, the undercurrent of this is a similar operating system, which is very important. And I think that's really something that other companies have to take into consideration. And it's really important to how this whole thing operates. And the other thing about that is one of the criticisms of Apple has been, as Apple hasn't opened up their system. Well, with the app system, basically they have. In fact, today, there's over $4.5 billion of apps being sold by Apple. And only 4 years ago, that was when they started. So they went from zero to $4.5 billion in selling apps, which is very successful. Now, people are very important. And I've talked about products, I've talked about process, but the undercurrent part of this is people. And we had a saying at Apple, pirates, not the Navy. We wanted people to operate together, we wanted to be as teams, we wanted to be nimble, we wanted to be small teams. We did a lot of ways to protect teams. We also wanted to recognize people for what they did, not recognize them by how many years you've been in the company, what your date of birth is, how long you've been there. So in the first Macintosh that came out the door, it had the back cover of the Mac, had the names inside of it of the 40 people that basically built the product. And I think that's the kind of recognition people talk about. Think back to my Xerox story. What do you think those engineers felt when all these products they built never hit the stage or hit the door? I think that's really important. The second part of that is teamwork. That one of the things Mr. Morito told us in Sony was the difference between the U.S. teams and the Japanese teams is that the U.S. teams, when somebody hits a home run, that's their hero. Somebody catches a long pass in football, their hero. In Japan, we play rugby. We all go across the finish line at the same time. And it really was a statement that really resonated in what we were doing. And I think that teams have been very important at Apple. And Steve was an important part of the teams. And the part about him going on stage and saying, this is a great product, made all of the Apple people very excited. Their life had been fulfilled. Even though it was tough work, they really had the fulfillment of what they're going to do. Now, I call this becoming cool. But you take the whole system, the ecosystem of Apple, from the time you develop a product to the time you bring it to the marketplace. Apple designed their own sales channel. And their own sales channel was their Apple Store. This is a store in Manhattan, New York. This store gets more photographs taken of it than the Empire State Building, and this store will do $600 million this year in sales. There's no other store chain in the world that's even near the amount of money they make per square foot from this store. It has totally changed the definition of how you sell your product. But what it relates to is brand. The brand of that product is really critical. And the brand is so powerful of Apple because of the kind of products they produce and the kind of value they have, that it really has caused a stir all over the place. Now, in 1984, we ran an ad. It was really the first really branding of Apple. The ad was called 1984. It was directed by a guy named Ridley Scott, who, and if you know anything about movies, is an Academy Award movie maker. And it basically, the day after that ad was run on a Sunday in a thing called the Super Bowl. The day after that ad, people were lined up around the stores. So it was the first time in the history of the computer industry that people actually lined up around the store to get to see the product. But today, every time Apple puts out a product, people line up. This is a photograph I took in Italy. It was the release of the iPod 2. It was more of an upgrade, but still, no matter what Apple does, that releases new products. I think that's really important. One of the things that I'd like to leave you with today is I'll call the challenge. At the end of my book, I write a letter to Steve Jobs and Apple. And what I say to him is, you need to look at what you're doing. The number one problem in the world today is health. And we need to be able to take
these devices and use them for health purposes. I need to be able to take blood pressures. I need to be able to read radioactivity. I need to be able to read rays of the sun. I need to be able to do things with this product that really connects me to my life. I think that's one of the challenges I gave him. Now, one of the other questions I've always asked is, did Steve read your book? I don't know if he did or not, but I do know that he didn't criticize it. I think he criticized all the other books. Also, I know that he took the letter that I wrote in the back and he circulated it to his staff and said, we need to do that. So I believe that this is a challenge that Apple has taken on. I think it's a challenge that the world has taken on. What's most important about my challenge is to all of us, everybody in the audience, anybody in corporations, is when Steve died, everybody, all of his customers around the world went to his store, laid flowers at the door, put notes on the door, and were very sorry that he died because he was so connected in their life. They felt so good about their products and so connected to that brand that they felt really bad when he died. And I think I felt really bad when he died too, because I believe that his legacy is one of a kind. I believe this is his legacy. And I believe that my idea, I wrote the book about a year ago, and at the time I wrote it, obviously I didn't anticipate what would happen to Steve. But the book itself, I've given you some view of it today, is about what it takes to be what I consider the new paradigm, which is leadership, which is the product. You've got to love the product. You've got to be connected to the product. It's the people. You've got to have the right talent. When I say people, I mean talent. I mean people that really can make things happen. The great thing about being interviewed by Steve Jobs, he didn't care about how old you were. He didn't care about what school you went to. He didn't care about what you've done in the past that got you to him. What he cared about is what is really inside you that makes you fit into what he needs to get done. And that's really the important part. And lastly, it's the process. How do we make things happen? How do we make things get to the marketplace? And how do we satisfy our customers? Thank you very much.